and she will not be happy, but I love prank videos. But there's this interesting phenomena that happens, and you saw it in all our videos, in the video this morning, that when presented with fear, there's kind of a natural tendency to maybe take a step back, to retreat, to react. Last week, Kelsey did a great job, a phenomenal job. Didn't she do a great job last week? Yeah. What a great job. Just talking about how fear is kind of part of our lives and how we respond to fear. But my friend Chris White, who is part of our tribe, everyone say hi, Chris.
Good morning.
Chris is a licensed marriage and family therapist. You went to Bethel Seminary locally. So he's kind of in a unique position where you work for, was it Sharp or Scripps?
Kaiser, actually.
Kaiser. Ooh, sorry, you're not welcome.
Shame.
Yeah. So you work in that arena. You help people with kind of mental illness and kind of their psychological journey and helping them achieve health there. So I thought Chris, would be the perfect person to kind of talk to us a little bit about why we respond in the ways that we do. When confronted with fear, we take that step back. It's kind of an instinctual reaction. Matter of fact, this is kind of the premise of our series, that when life gets overwhelming, when we're confronted with fear, we do one of 4 F's. We flight or flee, we fight back, we freeze, and then Chris was telling me that we do another thing called fawning. We fawn. So Chris, talk to us a little bit about that, kind of why we do that, the differences in the different F's and all of that.
Sure, thank you, Isaac. Yeah, so I like to put it as God has, I think Amy actually suggested as well, hardwired us or created us with some protective mechanisms for maybe not pranks, but situations that do necessitate immediate reaction. And so if you are walking down, for instance, we'll start with flight. You're walking down the hiking trail or something, and all of a sudden you see what you perceive to be a snake on the path. You shouldn't just keep walking towards the path of the snake, so you should move out of the way. And so just like that poor gentleman that had the snake put in his satchel or whatever, and you saw him jump out of the way, that's an example of flight. Your brain actually perceives it before your high-level cognitive functions are able to recognize that. You just recognize threat and you move.
So I know you and I were talking about it, and it's the part of our brain that is the, what do you call it?
The amygdala is the fire alarm response, so to speak.
The amygdala, just in case, you're looking for interesting conversation topics at the break room tomorrow, just throw out the word amygdala, you guys. So it's the part of our brain that controls, it's kind of the fire alarm part of our system. It says, snake, snake, danger, danger, run, run.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you want to impress your friends, just instead of saying I'm anxious, oh, my amygdala is overly activated today, so no, don't do that. Yeah, so that's the initial response to something where you have to get out, would be the flight. And then, of course, fight would be the opposite, where you're going towards something. Sometimes it's actually not, good or appropriate to run away. So if you're, they say when you're, same kind of thing, you're walking down a path and you see a mountain lion that you shouldn't run, but because you'll trigger the cat's instinct to chase you, so you should try to present a threat to the cat. So that would be, alternative example. And then going down the sequence there, freeze, that may be a situation where you need to hide. And so visual acuity by some animal may not be as strong for somebody that's just sitting there in a frozen place. So if you're camouflaged, that would be another reason to do that. And then the last one's a little less well known, and it's kind of strange sounding. But fawn is basically a way to be submissive. And that's kind of and there's maybe some controversy around this, but that's the one where you're basically trying to cause the least amount of damage to your body possible if you're in a no-win situation where you cannot do the first 3. So
interesting. Yeah. So what's interesting about this, it's all wired into us, right? So a lot of it it's just instinctual, it's normal. So how would you, just in seeing the various people that you see, how would you encourage them to embrace this versus to view maybe the tendency to flee or to freeze or to fawn as maybe a negative and bring shame upon themselves, because, when I think of flee, as a kid, I remember my dad saying, don't run, like, don't run. But instinctually, when life gets overwhelming, I want to run. So when I run and not stay, I just feel this shame because I didn't do what dad said. But what I hear you saying, and when we read scripture, like, this is how God has wired us. So how do you normalize that conversation?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I kind of look at things on a spectrum, and I would even put this phenomenon on the spectrum, I guess far to the high end of, we call it hyperarousal, or just being really, really anxious, or at a high threat, as compared to emotions. So we may run because there's a snake that we see and it triggers this response, or we may run because we're fearful and we may not have that fully engaged, but there's still a good idea to run. And so I think normalizing that this is a process that, in our faith, God has hardwired and made as part of the normal process for us. I think that is something that tends to help people feel less stigma surrounding that. And same with, kind of going down that spectrum to more of a normal daily response, anxiety or normal fear or any type of emotion. I think when we can, as a therapist, I should say, when I can tell people this is normal, this is a response that you are going to have as a human being, and it's not something that's wrong with you, I think that that's definitely something people appreciate, and they can start to be more reasonable with themselves, more compassionate. And I think that as a church body, I think that's really important as well.
Great. Now, there's the one side of these emotions being, hardwired into us, and it's a normal response. Now, it varies across people because the human brain and just the way we're wired, we're so complex. When does it spill over and become unhealthy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess it depends on the particular scenario, but certainly these normal physiological responses, if we're going back to the four Fs, they can be kind of highly put like almost on a hair trigger, if you will, based on a couple of factors. So, for instance, if and I think I have some colleagues that saw some people from the Las Vegas shooting who were dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so in those instances, the nervous system, because that's really what we're talking about, is the nervous system. When you go all the way to the four Fs, you're on really the hyperarousal of the nervous system. Those people need some help to calm down the nervous system. And so that may be a temporary thing that takes some time to go back to the normal baseline. Whereas if somebody has had a long history of trauma, they may go to one of these four Fs particularly, or any of them, more easily because they've been, unfortunately, it sounds terrible, but their experience has trained them that life is not safe. And so there's going to be all sorts of reasons that this may happen. And so what I really think it helps us to, what it makes us aware of, is the need to be graceful for the recognition we don't know what different people are going through.
That's so strong. Today we're specifically talking about flight or fleeing. We're going to cover the other Fs in the coming weeks, but today we're going to talk about fleeing. How have you seen that play out in kind of a positive way? How have you seen it play out in a negative way, perhaps? So, in other words, when does fleeing, which is good, become escaping, which could be unhealthy?
Sure, yeah, and when we put it in the clinical sense, we talk about anxiety all the time. The treatment for anxiety is actually leaning into the anxiety rather than avoiding it. So I do think it's a delicate balance. We have to try to confront the challenges in our lives, but sometimes, the confrontation is not particularly wise. So I don't need to confront the car that's driving down the road towards me if I'm in the middle of the street. But if there is a challenge in terms of I need to talk to somebody about a difficult conversation at work, that may be another thing. So I think that it bears, like anything, being reasonable, having some wisdom, because if we are just avoiding everything, if we're fleeing everything, clearly that's going to limit us from a lot of possible successes and things that God could do in our lives. So I think it is all about balance. And so we have to identify, I think, safety in a situation. That's a really big factor. So if there's something where there's a clear threat, emotionally or physically or otherwise, then that may be a situation where retreat is absolutely appropriate.
Great. As a community of faith, You talked about safety, and we have a Celebrate Recovery program that meets every Tuesday here, and the team does a phenomenal job. On any given Tuesday, there's about 20 people that are here, just journeying together as a family on that path of recovery, hurts, habits, and hang-ups. So I know safety is one of the hallmarks of the Celebrate Recovery program, but how could we be more sensitive, I guess? I know you touched a little bit about just being more gracious and graceful. How can we as a community of faith, knowing all of this and the tendency to fight, to freeze, to fawn, it's all normal, so there's no shame attached to it. How can we just be better aware and maybe create that safety in all the different environments that we find ourselves in? What would you tell the church?
That's a great question. I think that we have to be mindful, number one. So just being aware, I think, is a starting point of how our actions may impact other people. And, it goes into, I know we've talked with Pastor Mike in the past, or heard him talk about whenever there's a church function, to just kind of riff off a little bit what you said about Celebrate Recovery, how there's a recommendation that there's no alcohol or things of that nature, because there are some people that struggle with that, and that's totally valid, and we want to be mindful of that. And so I think that we're not going to know what's going on in somebody's life. And so we have to be really careful with trying to assume and trying to act like we're, all, omniscient, because we certainly are not. But I think just being mindful of how we talk about things, of being sensitive, and not in the overly sensitive manner, but just being aware of the words that we use and our biases, our stigmas. So I think a lot of times it really just starts with kind of the recognizing where we're starting from and recognizing how what we say may impact other people.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Chris. Hey, would you give it up to Chris? Thank you for loaning us your expertise this morning. Thank you. As Chris mentioned, thanks again, bro. So good. This morning, we're going to talk about the concept of flight or fleeing. And as Chris pointed out, it's wired into us. The 4 F's, they're part of who we are. They're how we respond in situations perhaps that are triggered by fear, perhaps triggered by a past experience, or when we feel overwhelmed in life. One of our responses is that we flee. We flight. Now, fleeing is so important because when used right, it actually gets us to a place of safety. And perhaps we've been in environments where we just need to get out of that environment. We need to find a safe place where we could heal and gain perspective. But more importantly, we need to get to a safe place so that we can encounter and hear the voice of God. So fleeing, when used right, is actually a very, very good thing. Today, we're going to look at a story in the life of King David. We've been journeying through the Old Testament this past year, and we've been intentional about being in the Old Testament for a long time because I think our bent is to be in the New Testament because we just love to talk about Jesus, right? So we've been studying the life of King David, and this morning we're going to look at a story in his life when he's on the run, where he actually engages in this act of flight or fleeing. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in 1 Samuel 22. We're going to look at 5 verses, just a portion of the story of David fleeing. If you remember, David is anointed as king at age 15 years old, but he does not become king for about another 15 to 18 years is David's story. And for that 15 years of waiting, he spends the majority of that time running away for his life because the king, his predecessor, King Saul, was threatened by David. He was jealous of David. He was envious of David's accomplishments. He was jealous of how God was using David so powerfully. So he was after David's life. If you read the verses before our text this morning, we see a story where David is at really his lowest of lowest points. He's running away from Saul. He's on the run. He's perhaps questioning God's plan for his life. Like, God, really? Like, Am I ever going to be king? Like, I didn't even ask for this. And here I am. My life's in danger. I'm on the run. The king wants to take my life. What are you doing in this season of waiting? He's so desperate that in the chapter before this, he actually pretends to be a mad person. Not angry, but he pretends to be cray-cray, just to get himself out of a really dangerous situation where Saul is after his life. So we can see just from this story leading up into our passage this morning that David is at a very, very, very peculiar and very, very desperate place in his life. So he does the normal thing that we all do, that most of us do. When confronted with danger, when confronted with overwhelming circumstances, the natural response is to run, is to flee. But what we discover in this story is that God meets David in his fleeing, that God uses it for a purpose. And likewise, God meets us in our flights, in our fleeing, in our escape. So let's read verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 22. It says this: David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him. And look what he says. It says, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. Verse 3, from there David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me? That's so significant because in his flight, he's listening to the voice of God. He's saying, I may be running, but God, I'm listening for the very next thing that you would have me do. The story goes on. Verse 4, so he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold. Verse 5, but the prophet Gad said to David, do not stay in the stronghold, go into the land of Judah. So David left and went to the forest of Hereth. It's kind of an odd story, but in this story, we see David escaping from danger. Now that word escape in verse 1, it's not a negative word. The word simply translates in the original language to flee for one's life. So it's him moving from peril, from danger to safety. It's actually a good thing. And I think sometimes there's a negative stigma attached to the word escaped. But in this context, really, escape turns to retreat. So when we think about fleeing and our tendency to flee perhaps when circumstances of life become overwhelming for us, it's really important that we know this, that we need to know the difference between retreating and escaping. There's a huge difference. When we retreat from a biblical sense, the idea of retreat is to take a step back from the busyness of life, from the overwhelming circumstances of life, from the perspective of fear. The idea of retreat is to take a step back so that we can engage God. Retreat looks like this. I'm going to remove myself from that situation and I'm going to move towards God. That's what retreat is. It's very different from escape. Escape is to avoid. Escape is to avoid. Escape is to, you know what, I'm not going to deal with it. Escape is, you know what, I'm going to quit going altogether because they hurt me. Because those people, they said negative stuff about me. Because, I'm so offended, so I'm not going to go to that life group anymore. I'm not going to go to that church anymore. How dare he? How dare she? They don't even know my story. Who do they think they are? You know what, I'm going to avoid altogether. That's escaping. Escaping is when we don't deal with the issue head on. Escaping is when we know that there's a problem, but we try to sweep it under the rug. Two different things. Retreat is I'm going to step back so that I can gain perspective. I'm going to step back so that I can have clarity. I'm going to step back so that I can just be with God and hear his voice. There's a spiritual discipline called solitude that encapsulates what the concept of retreat is like. But isn't it true that most times when it comes to fleeing, we escape instead of retreat? Because maybe we're afraid to confront the problem. Maybe we're afraid to see that person because we're not sure what the outcomes would look like, so we just don't deal with it altogether. And the great lie that escaping tells us, the great lie is this: it'll be better. It'll get better on its own. Or worse yet, hey, give it some time. You'll be better. Just don't deal with it. It'll be better in time. That's the great lie that escaping tells us. But truth be told, it does not get better over time. It does not get better. It does not get better on its own, and it does not get better over time. It gets buried. And then one day, after a long time, like a volcano, it explodes. And maybe it comes out as anger. Maybe it comes out as frustration. Maybe it comes out as you're just done and you're sick and tired of it. And you wonder to yourself, where did that come from? I'll tell you where that came from. It came because we escaped and we avoided and we did not deal with it. And we told ourselves and we believed the lie that it'll get better on its own, but it did not get better, didn't it? It got buried, and it usually comes out against the ones that we love the most. And they go, where did that come from? You've never once said that you were frustrated. You've never once said that you were sad. You have never once said that you were overwhelmed or unhappy. And the reason why you've never said it, and I've never said it, is because we've escaped. And we thought it would just get better on its own, but it got buried. And then one day it all came out. It doesn't get better, it gets buried. And here's the other thing about escaping. My dad told me this when I was a young kid. I remember being in Sunday school. I grew up in church, literally grew up in church. I was probably born in church too. But anyways, that's why I am so jacked up. But I remember being in Sunday school in first grade, and I did something to one of my friends in Sunday school, another kid, that really hurt him. I used some words against him that really hurt him. And it was this big thing, and the teacher knew about it, and all of a sudden parents got involved, and my dad was a pastor, and his parents, they were really upset because the pastor's son said something about their son, and it really hurt this boy. And I remember sitting at the dining table with my dad and us talking about it, and my dad saying, Isaac, you really need to apologize to him. And I said, no, you know what? Next week when we go to Sunday school, I'm just going to be extra nice to him. I'm just going to bring some toys, and we're going to share toys, and we're just going to avoid it altogether. And after some time, things are going to be fine. It's going to be water under the bridge. And my dad said this, and I'll never forget it. It stuck with me the rest of my life. He said this, Isaac, if you start to run now, you'll spend your entire life running. And for some of us, that's our story. When we look at fleeing, when we look at our tendency to escape, we run. And here's the thing, if we run now, we will run forever. See, escaping was not the way of Jesus. Retreating was the way of Jesus. Jesus constantly took a step back for the purpose of clarity, for the purpose of being with his Father, for the purpose of hearing what God would have him say and have him do. When you read the story of Jesus in the 4 Gospels, every single Gospel says this about the pattern of Jesus when it comes to taking a step back to draw closer to God. Let me give you a few illustrations here. In Mark and Luke, it says this, that Jesus, early, while it was dark, he went to a solitary place to pray. That was the pattern of Jesus. It tells us that he went up on a mountain by himself to pray alone. That was the way of Jesus. Retreating was the way of Jesus. When he was getting ready to choose his 12 disciples, I mean, this was epic, monumental, so important. These were the guys that were going to carry his message to the ends of the earth. The night before he was to handpick his 12 guys, he wasn't on YouTube listening to them speak. He wasn't looking at their resume. He wasn't calling references. Do you know what he was doing? It says he went to a mountain to pray all night. The day before, he was to select his 12 disciples. That was the way of Jesus. Jesus dealt with pain in his life and loss and grief by retreating and spending time with God. When his cousin, John the Baptist, was beheaded, do you know what Jesus did? He retreated to spend time with his Father so that he could have clarity, perspective, and so that he could hear the voice of God. The night before Jesus was to be arrested and crucified, do you know what he did? He retreated into a garden called Gethsemane to be with his Father. That was the way of Jesus. Retreating, guys, is not weakness. Retreating brings health. Retreating draws us closer to God. Retreating is the way of Jesus, and it should be our way too. But I know it's really hard to retreat. I mean, when we look at our lives, who can retreat? I mean, who has time for a retreat? I mean, we don't even have time for vacations. I mean, who has time? The way we structure our lives, guys, it's not conducive for retreat. I mean, think about it. We sit in rush hour. I mean, what a thought. I mean, who coined that phrase, rush hour? I mean, nobody is rushing in rush hour. We're just sitting, And when there's no traffic, we drive way too fast. The speed limit is a suggestion, is how we approach life. I mean, think about it. We move from appointment to appointment, email to email, meeting to meeting. We got goals that we need to hit. We have quotas that we need to hit. And then when we come home, we've got the kids to deal with. We spend our nights teaching our kids math, new math, as if we know any math at all. But we spend our evenings teaching them math or, meal prepping for the week, and then you have grocery shopping, and then you have car repairs, and then you have bills. You have all these things. You have ballet and soccer practice and rehearsal, and life is just busy, busy, busy. I mean, and then you have Stranger Things season 3 that everyone else has watched except you. Life is not built around the idea of retreat. And yet I've heard it said this way, that when someone was asked to describe the life and the way of Jesus in one word, this is the word he used. He said, unhurried. Ooh, I love that. Because Jesus was busy. When you read the story of Jesus, Jesus was doing a lot for God and for the kingdom of God. But never once do we find Jesus in a hurry. See, hurry is a sickness of the soul. If you want to write that down. Hurry is a sickness of the soul. Hurry is not just a disordered schedule. Hurry is a disordered heart. But when we see the pattern and the way of Jesus, there was no hurry. He was busy and yet unhurried. So in order to retreat, we need to be vigilant against hurry. So as we think about the areas of our life this morning, where might I need to retreat in my present life circumstances? Is there a situation that's going on that's just building and building and building and building, and the tension is rising and rising and rising and rising, and you're just becoming increasingly more frustrated and frustrated and frustrated and frustrated, and what you need to do and what God is encouraging you to do is to take a step back so that you can have perspective and clarity, so that you can hear what God is saying in the midst of it all. Where do you need to take a step back? Maybe it's in your marriage where it just feels like you're rubbing each other the wrong way. You're short with one another. Maybe you just need to take a step back so you can get clarity. Maybe it's a work environment that you just need to take a step back. Maybe you look at your calendar and it is just filled to the brim. And you know that the healthy thing to do for your soul is just to take a step back so that you can exhale. Where are you hurrying in life that God is calling you to slow down? What I love about the story that we just read is that God takes David to a cave. To a cave. I don't know if you've ever been to a cave. I know we live in the city. We're city folk, but here's what I know about caves. Caves are dark. There is no cell signal in caves. And that's where God brings David. It's almost as if God is detaching and unplugging David from the worries of the world. That's what retreat does, and that's what retreat is for us. It says this: David left Gath, and he escaped, that's a good word, to the cave of Adullam. That word Adullam is a powerful word. That word Adullam simply means refuge. It's translated refuge. And that's the power of retreat. Retreat enables us to seek refuge. Retreat allows us to just be. Rather than do, retreat allows us to be. In one of the most famous Psalms, it's Psalm 91. It's a psalm of Moses, we're told. Moses says this: whoever dwells, this is verse 1, whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge. All right, we need to work on our Bible here. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. That's a great verse to memorize, to pray over, to make that part of who you are. He is my refuge, my fortress, my God in whom I trust. So how do we do this? We know this is important. It's so important that when we take times out of our schedule to retreat, that we're strategic about retreating. One of the things that we get to do as a leadership team at the church, and it's one of my favorite things ever, is in the month of November, all our campus pastors, we go away for a few days. And we get to have fun, and we get to enjoy one another, we get to eat together, but the most special thing that we get to do is that we get to dream about what God is doing in our community. We get to dream and come up with, okay, God, what are you doing, not just in our city, but what are you doing in San Diego? And how can we be a part of that? It's one of the most life-giving times. There's no laptops. There's no cell phones. It's just us, the Lord, the scriptures. We go on prayer walks, and we just get to dream up, God, what are you calling us to do? And it's one of the most refreshing and soul-giving things that we get to do as a team. So you need to be strategic during those times that we retreat. The next thing we need to do is that we need to surround ourselves with people who can provide mutual encouragement during those seasons of retreat. See, while retreating is personal, there is also a relational component to retreating. In our story, what's so interesting is that as David is retreating, God brings around him people who would provide mutual support and encouragement to him. Now, these are the people that we wouldn't necessarily choose to be on our team, because it tells us the kinds of people, that came to David. They were in distress, they were in debt, and they were discontented. Those are like the EGR types. Do you know what EGR is? Extra grace required types. We don't have any of those at this church. They're at the other church, but I'm just saying, those are the people that God brings to David. The discontent, the in debt, those are the types that come alongside David. But when you read the story of David, what's so fascinating is that this group of ragtag people, this motley crew, they become some of David's mighty men. When you read the story of David, the many battles that he wins, his generals, the guys who are filled with courage, they emerge out of this group. Fascinating. That these 400 people, they become pillars in the leadership and in the reign of David. Here's what's so important. That in that season of retreat, God was doing something so profound in the life of David. God was telling David, before you become king of Israel, you need to learn how to be king of the cave. That I'm going to teach you how to lead my people through leading these people. That when you learn how to lead the people that you don't want, then I'll give you the responsibility of leading the nation and my people. See, some of us find ourselves in situations that are unpleasant. Some of us find ourselves in teams or environments that we would not necessarily have picked for ourselves. And God is telling us this morning, be a king of the cave. Be a queen of the cave. And if I can trust you in the cave, then one day I'll trust you with the kingdom. There's power in that. But these are the people that come alongside him that provide mutual encouragement and support for David in those times of his running. The next thing we need to do is that we need to keep our heart continually open to God. What I love about David, and we read this in verse 3, here's what it says. It says this in verse 3. From there, David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me? I love that. Because even in the midst of his cave experience, he's continually listening to God. I'm waiting for God to speak. The cave is not permanent. The cave is temporary. The cave is not the destination. The cave is part of the journey. The cave is not the end goal. The cave is just part of the process. And in the midst of that process, while I'm retreating and it doesn't seem like anything is going on, I'm king of nothing. I'm a king of these EGRs. I'm a king of the cave. I'm listening for what God is doing in my life. You know you're at a good place with God. In the midst of overwhelming situations, you're able to take a step back and say, okay, God, what are you saying in light of this that I'm going through? And we learn that about David. Now, it's really difficult to do that because we live in a world filled with noise. The other day, to illustrate this, I was watching the NBA Finals on the TV in the living room. Guys, I am still grieving over the loss of the Golden State Warriors. It hurts real bad, so just pray for me. But I was watching the NBA Finals on the TV. Everly, our 3-year-old, she was watching Peppa Pig on her iPad, like right there in front of me. And then, she calls it a WordPad, by the way, but it's an iPad, but she calls it a WordPad. Don't correct her. I'll be really mad at you because it's really cute right now. I'm watching the NBA Finals. She's watching Peppa Pig. Peppa Pig's a cartoon for those, yeah. Anyways, Peppa Pig's a cartoon. She's watching Peppa Pig on her WordPad. Kelsey's watching Bobby Flay while cooking in the kitchen. So we have 3 things going on, and there's just this pollution of noise going on. And I stop and think to myself, what are we doing? Nobody is listening to anything. We're listening to everything. Bobby and the commentators and, the little piggy's voice, Peppa Pig. This is just so confusing right now. And I think we live in that world. Someone said this about our generation and how much noise there is. They said this. They said that we are the most noise-polluted generation ever. They say we're rarely alone with our thoughts. And even when we are alone, we're not alone. But retreating is what helps us disconnect and hear the single voice that ultimately matters. And that is the voice of God. And we all need to hear the voice of God. Because the voice of God brings perspective. The voice of God brings clarity. The voice of God whispers peace into our chaos. Now, we're in a series called Pray. And one of the reasons why we called it Pray is because, it's an encouragement for us to lean into prayer in those moments when we're tempted to fight back or to flee or to freeze. But in every week's segment, we're introducing a prayer that David makes that corresponds to the life experience that we've just talked about. For this week, we're introducing Psalm 142. And in Psalm 142, it really is written out of this experience of David on the run while he's in the cave hiding. Matter of fact, if you turn your Bibles, the heading of 142, Psalm 142 would say something to this effect, that David wrote this while he was on the run from Saul in a cave. So the psalm corresponds to this life event. We're going to read the first 7 verses. Here's what the Psalm of David says, and really was a prayer of David. He says, I cry out aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell my trouble. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who watch over my way. In the path where I walk, people have hidden a snare for me. Look and see, there is no one at my right hand. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. I cry to you, Lord. I say, and here's the prayer, you are my refuge. You are my Adullam, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I'm in desperate need. Rescue me from those who pursue me, for they are too strong for me. Set me free from my prison, that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. Three things he says in this psalm. He shares his real feelings with God. He knows that God will never abandon him. And then he accepts God's comfort as he stays close to him. We get to do that too. So as we kind of round out our time this morning, what is a difficult circumstance that perhaps you're tempted to escape from, to run away from? But maybe God is calling you and I to press in, to lean into that situation, to lean into him. I want to end with the words of Jesus in Matthew 11. They're really powerful words. Here's what Jesus says. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. This word rest is really powerful because it comes from a place of retreat. That we get rest when we retreat. That we get rest when we take a step back and we move towards God. Really powerful. This word rest, it's more than a body word. It's more than a mind word. It's a soul word. In other words, Jesus is saying, hey, those of you who have soul fatigue, you know what body fatigue is. You know what mind fatigue is. But he says, those of you who have soul fatigue, he says, come to me. Do you know how you have soul fatigue? Here are the symptoms of soul fatigue. You don't hear God's voice anymore. The passion and the fire that you have for God is waning dim. Your spiritual disciplines that you've committed that really empower you, that bring life to you, slowly you have kind of placed them on the back burner. Those are some symptoms that you have soul fatigue. You don't enjoy life anymore. You don't enjoy the blessings and the things that God has poured into you. Those are symptoms and signs of soul fatigue. And Jesus says it this way, if you have soul fatigue, come to me. I love that word, come to me. It means cling to me. And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. See, our souls were never meant to be easy, but our souls were never meant to be easy. Our souls were meant to have an easy yoke. That's so important. Our souls were meant to carry an easy yoke. And Jesus says this morning, when you retreat, when you take a step back, when you cling to me, your soul will be easy. Life would not be easy, but your soul's yoke will be light. Three things to apply this morning as we round out our time. How can we begin to retreat? There's three ways. It's what I called a minute retreat, a daily retreat, or an extended retreat. And the good news about this is that we all can do this. A minute retreat simply looks like this. That during the day, you designate certain times during the day where you're going to pause for a whole 60 seconds. You're going to turn off the Instagram. And you're just going to engage God. For 60 seconds, you're going to be still. You're going to be quiet. You're going to say, God, would you just speak to me? God, would you just calm my soul? God, my soul is heavy. Would you give me your yoke that's light? You can do this. Maybe it's 1 minute in every hour. Maybe it's 1 minute before every meal. But we all could do a minute retreat daily. The next way is a daily retreat. The daily retreat is just time that we've set aside and carved out. It's uninterrupted time that God knows and that we know that we have an appointment with God during this time of the day. Maybe it's something you do first thing in the morning. Maybe it's your first 15 minutes of the morning where you say, God knows and I know that we have a standing appointment together. And maybe it's just your time of just worshiping Him. You turn on a Christian worship song and it's just you and God just having that moment together. Maybe it's time in God's Word. Maybe it's just a book that you read. Maybe it's a walk that you take. But it's designated, uninterrupted, daily retreat time with God. And then the last thing is an extended retreat. And it's so important that we build those times into our calendar where we take time out. You go somewhere. You do a staycation. You go to Palm Springs where you take extended time out. Not to work. It's not a working vacation. It's a rest retreat vacation. 3 ways we can do it. And when we do that, our souls will be healthy. They will be healthy. Let's pray this morning. Father, thank you for wiring us the way you have. God, thank you that it's normal to flight, to flee. God, in situations of danger, in situations of peril, in times where life becomes overwhelming. God, I pray that you would help us know, Father, healthy ways to retreat, to flee. Thank you for the invitation, Father, and the way of Jesus that we learn. That we can take a step back to gain clarity, to gain perspective, to hear your voice. So, Father, I pray for whatever cave that we're in, whatever difficult environment that we find ourselves in. Would you give us the courage, Father, to retreat daily, to retreat, Father, at designated times during the day, and then to retreat extendedly so that we can dream, so that we can discover purpose. God, so that creativity could flow, so that your ideas and your plan for us could emerge in our hearts and our minds. So, Father, I pray for anyone here who's just overwhelmed by life. And we see it boiling up, and we feel it boiling up within us. God, would you bring rest to our souls? Help us know, Father, that you truly are our refuge, our fortress, and our help in time of need. God, and when the temptation is to hurry, Father, give us the courage to rest and to slow down and to seek you, knowing that you will be found in our seeking of you. So we pray all of this, and we ask all of this in Jesus' name. And everyone said,